Chapter 11. Print. What a slog, huh? All of that Nazi business, Jesus Christ. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, I'm sure we're all ready to get into the meat of it. But before we do that, I reckon it's time for another little digression. So let me take you back to a little century called the 15th century. In 1469, I'm serious, in 1469, Johannes von Speyer and his brother, Vindelius, traveled from Western Germany across the Alps to reach Venice, the Republic of Venice, right? It's separate from Italy, its own republic, with an amazing new machine in tow. You see, the Republic of Venice had a policy of protecting the businesses of foreigners arriving in Venice to encourage the importation of novel ideas. And the novelty of the machine that these brothers were bringing in could not be disputed. The von Speyers brought, in that year, a printing press to Venice. That new machine that had previously been crafted by Gutenberg and inspired awe all around Europe. Because of this invention, books were on the verge of going from a prohibitively expensive and rare commodity, something to be only kept in the personal libraries of lords and kings and bishops, to a powerful engine of societal change. The catalyzing force, you might say, of the Enlightenment. But by 1469, few could have guessed how radical this transformation was going to be. And so, when Johannes von Speyer issued a request to the Venetian Collegio, which was the main executive body, to have his printing business protected, they granted him a 5-year monopoly on printing in Venice. Anyone not named Johannes von Speyer would not be allowed to make a business of this new craft. In fact, he was probably not the first to own a printing press in Venice, but he was the first to set up a business with it, and now, with his special license, he was very well positioned to make an absolute fortune off of it. This patent was the first known instance of a technological patent in Europe. Maybe you've heard that Venice would go on to become the undisputed printing capital of Europe. And that is true, right? So you might wonder how that, and the fact that one man's business alone was allowed to print, go together. And the reason is that Johannes von Speyer, with his printing monopoly, undertook what for a blossoming proto-tech billionaire might be described as the selfless act of dying a few months in, rendering the monopoly void. Why did he die? I don't know. I mean, it was the Middle Ages. You know, people just died. Maybe he failed to answer Abridge Trolls Riddles 3. I don't know. He died in any case. And his brother Vindelius tried to appeal to the Collegio, but in those few months between granting this monopoly and Johannes dying, the officials had gotten a better idea of what a big deal printing was and what a blunder it had been to grant such a patent in the first place. The monopoly was not considered transferable, unfortunately for Vindelius, who was granted no such thing. In fact, nobody would be granted such a thing ever again, not at least in the Republic of Venice. how did those early printing presses work anyway? Let's recall. Construction was in the domain of the goldsmith. You needed a hard frame, and then you would set small bronze letters into this frame. And then ink would be applied to this frame and the letters, and then you would press this just frame against a piece of paper using a large turning screw, the kind that you would have previously used to press grapes with. And this process would be repeated for every page of the book as many times as the number of copies that you would like to produce. It was still, in other words, unbelievably tedious and expensive. A huge investment for any printer. And yet, it still only presented a fifth of the cost of the only previous method, which was copying it by hand with ink and feather. Printing, with the von Speyer monopoly rendered void, took off in a big way. And as previously mentioned, in a bigger way than anywhere else in Europe, right? Venice, as a harbor town, had the advantage over other large European cities of having access to the cheapest paper, since this was being imported by way of the Mediterranean Sea from Egypt and Syria. Printers started popping up all over Venice. Books were in very high demand, and printers set out to give the population what they wanted. Since printers would often crowd around the most popular titles, these works would sink in price due to abundance, right? And printers would not receive adequate returns on their investment in this case, right? The competition was fierce, the pressure was immense. Journals from the time survive telling of printers despairing, going so far as dying by suicide in this environment. It was these circumstances that the kind of patent granted to von Speyer had been meant to stave off. It wasn't so much a question of protecting an inventor's intellectual property, a concept that was yet to develop, as it was a matter of ensuring that the merchant who invested in expensive equipment would see good returns. Over the decades, new precedents would be set that lay the foundation for modern copyright law. One printer and author in 1486 successfully requested a patent from the Collegio that he be granted the exclusive right to print his own book concerning the history of Venice. As the book's subject was considered a contribution to the common good, the author was granted this special privilege. This, once again, represented a reward for the author for producing a volume of public interest rather than this being a recognition of ownership over the text. Right? Other such requests followed, and in 1517, the Collegio issued the Venetian Decree of Press Affairs, which was a more comprehensive effort to, on the one hand, introduce artificial scarcity into the blossoming book market, while also formalizing restrictions on what kinds of works might be patented. Any texts older than the decree, for example, could not be patented, or old texts in any case. While the concept of intellectual property was still centuries away, the foundation for it had been laid in Venice. And because intellectual property is a factor in my story here, I thought it might be worthwhile to look at these origins too. So that's what this chapter was about. But I'd like to leave you with another anecdote that I think fits in quite nicely from the period and geographically and the topic of books and printing. To return to an earlier point, it is hard to overstate what a game-changing effect the abundance of books had on Europe. The Protestant Reformation, for instance, was unthinkable without it, because the central idea to that was that the population should be able to read the Bible in their own language, which required a lot of printing to be done. But while we like to speak of the Enlightenment in terms of Europe becoming more civilized as its population became more literate, it's also worthwhile to remember that this new paradigm came with its shadow side. The von Speyer brothers, from the beginning here, would have crossed the Alps by way of the Brenner Pass. At least, I strongly assume so. That would have made a lot of sense. Don't take my word for it, I guess. It's a very pretty valley, right? These days there's a very busy highway there since it's the main connection between Germany and Italy. Back then, it would have been a more tedious journey, obviously, especially with a big old machine. On the one end of the pass, you've got Venice, let's say, okay? And on the other side, on the northern side, you have Innsbruck, which they would have passed through when they did in 1469. 15 years later, in 1484, a man named Heinrich Kramer, the inquisitor of the Austrian city of Innsbruck, brought a trial against a young woman who had had a distaste for the man and his sermons and was not afraid to speak her mind. The apparently thin-skinned Kramer wanted to try her as a witch, and his evidence against her included long speculations about her sexuality. The not yet propagandized population, as well as the bishop himself, disapproved of Kramer's weird shit, and he was expelled from Innsbruck. After his expulsion from Innsbruck, Heinrich Kramer went on to write an incredibly important piece of propaganda, a book called the Malayos Maleficarum, also known as the Hexen Hammer, usually translated as Hammer of Witches. The text was a pornographic and downright insane piece of fiction presented as fact, describing the supposed rituals of witches and their pacts with the devil in lurid detail. This text was widely printed and reproduced, capturing the public's imagination, and would be cited in witch trials over centuries. People often associate witch trials with the medieval age. That's wrong. It went hand in hand with the so-called Enlightenment, right? And while I'm not going to tack on the entire story of witch trials onto this digression, I will say this. Tens of thousands of people were murdered over this bullshit fantasy over the next couple of centuries, right? Overwhelmingly women. It is a horrific stain on our culture. Western historians have a long and shameful record of downplaying the significance of witch trials, but as much as we may hate to admit it, fake news and barbarism are part of the DNA of the enlightened European. This chapter seemed like it would be more fun in my head, okay? But next week, I've got a really nice one for you. We're gonna start our next deep dive, which... Am I gonna tell you what that's about? No, I guess not. Spring is here. Go out and enjoy the spring, you know? Be nice to people. It's great weather to make a pact with the devil and have an orgy in the forest. See you there. What am I talking about? I'm signing off. Be well, be nice, go in peace. See you next week.